Hello, Friday morning, first thing for me, and I've just gone to the Financial Times and learnt what the European leaders have been up to in their summit. And so that's all I'm going to do today. And I think it's amazing. It's something. As I've been saying for years now, there's nothing that they can do. It's an impossible situation. So they've done something, and what they've done could be decided to be good or bad. It doesn't really matter. It's still something that hasn't changed the fact that it's an impossible situation. But they are politicians and must be seen to do something, so have done something. Now, it's going to take a long time to work out, A, if the things what they have said stick, and then how the intelligent people that can really dig into these things and work out if they make any sense at all. On the surface, I can see that they will maybe superficially look good. But looking at them and just reading it once, I go, oh my God. As in, yes, you've done something, you've said something, but really. But then I just throw myself back onto, well, what have you been saying for 2 years? What could you possibly expect from them in an impossible situation? Something, right, this is their opening something. And basically there are two somethings here, which I'll talk about, and might talk about bailing in, because I haven't really talked about that as much. Right, Peter Spiegel in the Financial Times, who is their #1 man in Brussels. Spain wins restructuring of bank deal. Eurozone leaders agreed to radically restructure Spain's €100 billion bank recapitalisation plan. So we find that we know what they are referring to. Spain's €100 billion bank recapitalisation plan. We know what they're referring to, so that's all right. Allowing EU bailout funds to eventually be injected directly into teetering Spanish financial institutions. Right. Allowing EU bailout funds, and now we're talking EFSF, which is the old one, and in a couple of months when everything has been ratified, the new one will be the ESM, to take over from the EFSF, maybe with a bit of overlap. So those are the EU bailout funds referred to. EU bailout funds to eventually, and there's a reason for the eventually, we might not get into it, but it's actually in the article, be injected directly into teetering Spanish financial institutions. So I'll finish the sentence because it kind of tidies it up slightly, meaning Madrid can sweep the burden of the bailouts off its sovereign books. So the first idea was to give the money to Spain, and Spain then gives it to an outfit called FROB, who is the outfit set up to do something about the banks. So now, instead of going to Spain, so it has to go on the Spanish books, it goes directly to the banks. It probably will go directly to FROB, but they will say it's going to FROB, it's not going to the Spanish government. Okay. Now, I said it has to go to the Spanish government, and why? Because who was in charge of the Spanish banks, who is in charge of the Spanish banks, who will be in charge of the Spanish banks? The Spanish government, or agencies of the Spanish government. So it's only right if they screwed up, or it's just where the responsibility is. You give the money to where the responsibility is. The responsibility for the Spanish banks was directly with the Spanish government. So they screwed up. So you give the money to the Spanish government and say, try and rectify this best you can. But obviously you are borrowing money from the EFSF or ESM. So it's got to go onto your sovereign books. The idea here is the Spanish government sits back and the money zooms past them straight into FROB or straight into the banks. And they go, nothing to do with us. Right? You can see why, because it lifts the indebtedness of the sovereign nation, Spain in this case. But if it goes straight into the banks, it doesn't. Right. The change, agreed as part of a deal struck in the early hours of Friday morning. Note, do not do mega deals like this in the early hours of the morning. It won't happen immediately, however. Instead, the leaders agreed, politicians, bless, it would come only after the Eurozone set up a single banking supervisor to be run by the European Central Bank. So what they're saying is, don't worry, Spain. We know that in the past it was all your responsibility. At the moment it's your responsibility. For a little bit in the future it will be your responsibility, but we are going to take over. Or at least we are going to point our finger at the European Central Bank, who have been a bunch of bastards and not paid and forcing us to play around with the EFSF and ESM, the bastards. We're going to point the finger at them and say, you now appoint a single banking supervisor to overlook all the banks of what? Europe or the Eurozone or whatever, to be decided. Sort it out, sort it out. So the European Central Bank go, what the fuck? And say, supervisor of all these banks? Okay, George, you've got the job. And George goes, okay, how much a year? Really? Yeah, okay, I'll supervise your banks for that. And then you've got a European banking supervisor who would need to be a genius. His team would need to be geniuses, and they would have to be paid huge quantities of money. Basically, it's not possible, but hypothetically, that's what you'd need to supervise all the Eurozone banks, who are geniuses, highly paid, and paid to get round all sorts of supervision rules. But one of the big problems is the poo is now. The poo is now. So Georges and his team go, I'm going to look after it from here now, whatever the date is. But look at all this poo. They have created all this poo. How can I supervise all this poo? I'll try and clean it up from here on in and get it better and better. But the poo is here and now. And that is the problem. The poo is here and now. And the politicians have thought, well, European supervisor, it's on the way to having a banking supervising union, which is going to be part of a fiscal union, blah, blah, blah. They're only people, and it's early in the morning, and they'll have a few supervisors, but they won't be listening to them, and they'll be just bickering, and they don't really know much at all. So they'll be agreeing to all sorts of things that don't really make any sense. But referring right back to the beginning again, it's an impossible situation. They've got to be seen to do something, so they're going to do something. And they've done this. All right. So there will be a banking supervisor somewhere in the future, and the poo is now. So when you're a bank now and you're full of poo, what do? Do you put your hand up? They'll just be quiet for the moment and see how things settle. But just put your hand up and say, actually, and it's going to be first to be putting their hands up will be the best one. After 25, put their hands up, and the ESM is meant to be writing checks to everybody, that they might go, right, okay, again, right. Now, you can imagine the problems with this. So, and the government will encourage it, because the government will encourage the banks to put their hands up and say, you get the money off these ESM Berks that are going to give it to you and become equity in you. You know, they're standing back from this now. They'll say, watch the money flash past them in floods into the banks. They'll get as much as they can into the banks. Italy, Spain, everybody, Cyprus, France, everybody, where the ESM thinks it's going to get all this money from. The ESM, the new one coming, is the one that goes, is it 16? It's the one I work out, two lots of 18, 16, I think, 32, and then a 16. Does that add up to 80 billion? That's the let's say cash. I've said in the past it's kind of dry cleaning tokens. But let's say that's by 2015, I think it was, that all the European nations put between them 80 billion into this ESM. That's their major commitment to this ESM, is to put by 2015 between all of them 80 billion into this ESM, and with that money as a guarantee, the ESM can go to the market and say, buy our bonds. So they sell bonds. They say, well, we'll take this much money off you, and we'll give you so much interest rate over 10 years, standard bonds. So the money comes into the ESM, and then it's going to flood out to these banks. Okay. So who's going to buy all these ESM bonds, which they're talking about aren't going to be senior anymore either. And they're going to go to recapitalize, as in to buy equity in the poo-ridden banks of Europe. So who's going to want to buy that, knowing that that's where their money is going to get invested? Right, let's go to bailouts and bail-ins. That would be a bailout if the ESM comes in, like to Bankia, which is just pure poo, and says, we will take 20 billion in equity in your bank. Right? What happens in a bankruptcy is you get the equity holders, the owners, when in the stock market, you buy a stock or a share, same thing. Equity, you buy equity, all the same thing. You buy a part ownership of a company. That gives you part of the upside. It gives you ownership and a dividend, maybe, if the company makes a profit. Right? That is first to be hit in a bankruptcy. All of those people lose all their money. The second lot of people to be hit are the subby bondholders. Obviously, it's the more complicated the company, the more complicated the debt structure. But basically, let's say you've got equity, sub-debt, and senior debt. Subby debt are next to be eaten, because when they lend money to, let's say in this case, the bank, they get a higher interest rate than the senior bondholder, knowing that if there is a bankruptcy, they don't have a lien on any of the bits and bobs of the company, let's say, or bank. So they get, because it's higher risk, they get a higher interest rate. So what happens is they're next to be eaten after equity's all gone. The subby debt are next to be eaten, right? And then you come to senior debt, which has got lots of contractual grab on the stuff in the company. They're actually pari passu, which means equal with the deposit holders, you and me, in the bank. It's a very strong position to be senior debt. But what you can do, a bit like what happened in Greece, is say to people like senior bondholders, you're senior bondholders, but this is pure poo. This is pure poo. There's nothing there for you. Absolutely nothing there for you. So what we can do is to swap you over from being a senior bondholder to being equity. Basically, all the senior bondholders then become the owners of all that poo. They're the poo owners. So they just write it so you're not a bondholder anymore, cross, write you in equity tickets, stock shares, equity in the entire company. You now own it. You do something with it. And that's kind of what is called a bail-in, right? But big note here from Mystic. That is a good idea in isolated circumstances. If you start doing that with lots of banks in Europe, the whole thing falls down. I'll leave it there. You just have to take my word for it. Nobody knows, except a Mystic. Mystic knows. If you do that too much, the whole thing falls down, because banking is inherently faith-based. It's bollocks, basically. But it works because it works, as long as it works. But doing that, bailing in too much, all the faith comes out, deposit holders will come out, bond holders will come out, there's no money in the banking system, the whole thing collapses. Okay. So that's where they are at the moment on the banking system. They had to do something, they've done something that I think is impossible that will going to turn out right, that they're going to somehow sell bonds to the ESM bond prospective bondholders to get lots and lots of money, hundreds of billions presumably, and then they're going to give it as equity because they don't want to start this domino effect. But you can, of course, wipe other people's equity out and subby bondholders, and then go in, say, with the senior debt holders of senior debt now own the whole company, and then come in on top of them to give even more equity. So there's enough basis for a company. So you've got the senior bondholders turn to equity, and you can come in on the top of it. But as I say, if you do too much of that, the whole thing falls down. So they might do with like Ireland, where they basically said, don't touch anybody. Don't touch, you can have a go at the equity, but leave the bondholders alone. Okay. And that's likely to be what they do. But they might, at the moment, they're not even planning to touch equity. They're just going to boost equity. Equity is running away, of course. They don't want to be owners of poo. So as the equity is running away, they're going to come in with ESM funds to boost the equity back up. Billions. How many hundreds of billions are they going to need? Anyway, the idea is that this will give everybody so much faith in the European banking system that these hundreds of billions will not be necessary. I go, I hope you're right. Anyway, so that was the first bit. Let's go on to the sovereign. Under revised rules demanded by Italy. Now, I don't like the idea of this demanded by Italy, but it's negotiations, so you will get demands. But demands are a bit strong coming from weaker nations, isn't it, really? But hey, that's the way it is, of course. Countries that want the Eurozone bailout fund to purchase their bonds, that's Italy, Spain, all the pigs basically want the Eurozone bailout funds, ESM, to buy their bonds, sale and demand. If the ESM buys their bonds, sale and demand, the price will go up because the demand goes up, interest rates come down. An essential way of lowering their borrowing costs, yes, will no longer be subject to Greek-style monitoring programs. Italy wants the money. They want the ESM to buy their bonds, but don't want the Troika coming into Rome and camping there and upsetting people. Instead, they would simply have to maintain their EU debt and deficit commitments, though EU authorities could mandate tighter deadlines and timetables. So basically, thrown back onto the beefed up I forgot what they called it at the turn of the year, where Germany said, look, we're going to have to take these deficit percentages seriously this time. Okay. Italy is expected to make use of the new bond purchase plan. Yeah, I'm sure they will. But I'll come back to that. It is double satisfaction for Italy, said Mario Monti, the Italian Prime Minister. But for Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, who had for months insisted she would agree no new short-term rescue measures, the deal was a significant concession. So what we've got here is the ESM now. And again, it seems that the government can click their fingers, I don't know how it's going to work, and say, buy our bonds. They've gone up to 5.3%. Let's keep them at 5 and buy some of our bonds, will you? Obviously, the criteria will be decided somewhere else. Maybe Georges will do that as well. But again, the governments can go, oh, no worries. Okay. Because Italy have done the most wonderfully complicated shenanigans with buying and the way they're doing their government debt and pretending it's just like they're doing the old civs, special investment vehicles, to get the actual spending off the books. They're manipulating their books, something chronic, so they can keep under these criteria that were set, and they can do that easily. So as long as they do that and they keep the troika out to stop checking that too much, they can say, well, our bonds, the market can see this and can be tearing their hair out and won't buy the bonds. So Italy can go, bond buy, ESM, have it sent round. And again, the commitment from everybody is only to the ESM 80 billion in up to 2015, the equivalent of nothing. They think they're going to get this for absolutely nothing. The banks are going to be made safe. The sovereigns are going to be able to borrow cheaply, all for 80 billion shared out among all of them, because the market will pile into the buy ESM bonds by the hundreds of billions and sort all this out. And that's the impossible answer to the impossible situation on this fair Friday morning. And we'll just have to see now what everyone thinks of this. There were only 5 comments on this article this morning, and I think 4 of them were favourable, saying at last they've done something constructive. We'll see. Bye.